This is as much a homage to Cedric Price as it is to Hans Ulrich himself, because he's a huge fan of Cedric's Fun Palace. And so 2 years ago, I was preparing one of my design studios for the GST at Harvard on the subject of contemporary art museum. And I went to speak to Hans Ulrich. And he was directing me to the Fun Palace as a model to look at, as a model for multidisciplinarity, for unpredictability, and for change. And as I'm sure you've heard before, the Fun Palace is a design for an unenclosed steel structure with prefabricated walls, platforms, floors, and ceiling modules that can be moved and assembled by cranes into theaters, cinemas, restaurants, workshops, and scrapped continuously. Hans Ulrich and I had quite a few conversations about the diversity that exists in contemporary art. I was very inspired by the way he looks at contemporary art and his interest in the simultaneity of this diversity to be experienced in the context of a museum. And of course, this is not what contemporary art is incredibly diverse in its outlook, but perhaps as an architect, I could say that museums that house this contemporary art are probably not as diverse in spatiality as the art that they exhibit. So we talked about the different dimensions of art. Hans Ulrich talks about them as dimensions. I think another way to think about them is perhaps a museum with a lot of museums inside, or the museum almost as a Matrushka doll, where it has many museums inside. So we talked about how to classify contemporary art at large as it exists right now, how we could imagine the anti-museum as a kind of an art to cater for the kind of iconoclasm, art that works against the conventions of the museum, the artist museum to cater for artist-run spaces. The book museum is probably another kind of artistic practice that explores non-traditional archives. You could say Armin's work is about that. The chapel museum would cater for the works of a single artist. The dream museum would cater for art dedicated to illusions or dreams. The garden museum would cater for the creative encounter between the man-made and the natural. The house museum would cater for art that is dedicated to the idea of domesticity and perhaps a very small scale. The lab museum would cater for the encounter between art and science. The mobile museum would be dedicated to now. It would address the art of the temporary as part of its makeup. The nano museum would be dedicated to the world that is far too small to be seen with just your eyes, so it would have to give you a different way of looking at the art. The time museum would be dedicated to time as its medium, so it wouldn't be working with space, but more as its with time. The virtual museum perhaps could be dedicated to art, or perhaps to the unrealized museums, ideas about museums. And finally, the shed museum that would cater for painting, sculpture, photography, video, and performance art. So if we put all of these together, different kinds of artistic practice that a museum has to provide space for, a platform for, and organize them into a kind of a matrix, this kind of circle, according to the elements of a gallery that they would use, whether they would use a floor, a wall, and all of its surfaces of the museum, according to their size, indicated by the size of the circle. And we look at these different types of artistic practice or museum that I just showed. we find that each of them indicate a very specific spatial set of conditions, as you see, for example, by how the Shed Museum occupies the circle, the Artist Chapel would occupy different areas of this circle. There is not really time to go into all of these, but the House Museum, the Lab Museum, the Mobile Museum, the Dream Museum, the Artist Museum, the Book Museum, the Time Museum. And so when they all come together in a museum, they all have very diverse requirements. And of course, this really begs the question as to how can really a single museum cater for all these different spatial requirements at any one time. And there is, of course, then, just going beyond my conversations with Hans Ulrich, of course, this classification continues to expand, continues to evolve. We will have other kinds of artistic practices, and therefore it's almost an impossible situation for an architect where you want to produce the kind of the specifics for each piece of artwork, and yet you are dealing with a building that is done at once and has to kind of live this multiple life across time. So I think another way of looking at this diverse artwork is really looking at each one of them individually, detach them from their perhaps the subject matter. And Hans Ulrich gave me 250 artworks to analyze. And if you look at those 250 in different ways, in this case is according to scale, you see that they range from nano to the giga. I mean, the range varies enormously. In weight, they range from the really lightweight that you see here. A lot of them are lightweight, to the really, really heavy on the right. In climatic requirements, there are artworks that require controlled environment, meaning air conditioning, on the left, and many more of contemporary artworks now do not require air conditioning, and yet we build these museums that are fully redundant with air conditioning absolutely everywhere. If we look at the surfaces of a gallery that these 250 artworks use, we see that, for example, on the left are the artworks that use the floor. The next is the wall. So the idea that a museum is defined by walls is something also to be questioned, because as of right now, many more of contemporary artworks use the floor. Lighting requirements. Again, there is an incredible range in terms of the kinds of special requirements that contemporary art require. So this does make the Fun Palace let's say, a very pertinent model to look at for its vision of changeability, of interdisciplinarity, the fact that we don't really want to go from one art experience to another. We want to see them all next to each other. We want to experience their frictions. We want to see them as if the museum is a cabinet of curiosity. And so the question is, how does one single museum that is built at once provide this? I think a way of re-examining the idea of a building that moves with cranes today is to think of it as a museum that is multi-static. So it is a spatial system that has different spatial scenarios built into it, programmed into it, and these become activated at different times over its life. Perhaps similar to Solovyt's art that has a kind of an internal logic that produces incrementally different series of variations. We could think of these different spatial scenarios as programs that we function into a certain form, as the kind of the software into the hardware or the architecture. So in my studio, we looked at, for example, how we could look at grids that are not just about efficiency and homogeneity, but that perhaps they are redundant, and the redundancy is functional over time. They render different scenarios over time. This is Johan's structural grid, that this same grid at different times produces different kinds of gallery arrangements. So different ways of adaptation, if you like, by curators, by artists. This is another one of my studio grids, working with a different geometry. This is Kai's, and how it unfolds scenarios over time. A single grid that produces spaces that are tiny, spaces that are large, spaces that open differently to each other, are differently articulated. So it's a museum that is highly specific. It lacks, however, conclusiveness. It is open. It can be programmed. For example, structurally, the same grid can bear weights of different degrees, so that you can have art that is heavy in some areas and art that is lighter in some areas. It can vary environmentally to become more or less porous in different areas, so that it can become actually more efficient in its redundancy to cater for art that can happen in open air and art that does require air conditioning. Lighting, for example, grids can be differentiated, or you could say they can be made redundant to somehow produce greater amounts of light and less amounts of light. So I guess my point today is to say that, well, the Fun Palace can be a fantastic, relevant model today in the context of the Contemporary Art Museum, because of its advocacy for incompleteness, because of its advocacy for user interactivity. But perhaps we need to move from cranes, which were perhaps an old idea of technology, to perhaps us programming through design intelligence, working perhaps through digital means, with the idea of spaces that are complex, that are multi-static, that have different conditions programmed in them, that can be unleashed or be activated over time by others. Thanks.